George Washington, Part 3, Inventing the Presidency and Guarding the Republic, 1783-1799. Chapter 9, A Farmer Once More. Return to Mount Vernon and the Constitutional Crisis. When George Washington resigned his commission in December 1783 and returned to Mount Vernon, he hoped that his days of public service were largely behind him. In a gesture widely praised at home and abroad, he had relinquished military power and embraced the role of private citizen and farmer. To many Americans, this act confirmed that the new republic would not follow the path of so many revolutions that ended in dictatorship. To Washington himself, it was a long-awaited opportunity to devote his energies to his estate, his family, and the quieter responsibilities of civilian life. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington immersed himself in the details of plantation management. He resumed his experiments with crop rotation and diversified agriculture, shifting away from tobacco and expanding wheat production, milling, and other ventures. He introduced new tools, adjusted field layouts, and recorded yields with meticulous care. As before, he supervised enslaved laborers and craftsmen, inspecting work, planning improvements, and trying to maximize productivity. These years deepened his identity as a practical man of the land, aware of both the promise and fragility of American agriculture. Yet even as Washington focused on his estate, his correspondents and visitors kept him fully informed about the young republic's troubles. The Articles of Confederation, which loosely bound the states, created a weak central government with limited authority and no reliable revenue. Congress struggled to pay debts from the Revolutionary War, regulate trade, or address interstate disputes. Individual states pursued conflicting economic policies, issued their own currencies, and sometimes defied national agreements. Events like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, an uprising of indebted farmers protesting taxes and foreclosures, deeply disturbed Washington. He saw in such unrest a warning that the revolution's gains could unravel if the government lacked strength and legitimacy. What had been won at great cost could be lost through disunity, economic instability, and factionalism. In letters to former comrades and political leaders, he expressed growing concern that something must be done to strengthen the Union. Calls for reform culminated in the proposal for a convention to revise the Articles. Initially reluctant to re-enter public life, Washington was persuaded that his presence was essential to the convention's success. Friends argued that his reputation for integrity and impartiality could help unify delegates and reassure the public that any proposed changes were not a plot to impose tyranny. After some hesitation and assurances that he would not be expected to play a partisan role, Washington agreed to attend the convention in Philadelphia in 1787. At the Constitutional Convention, Washington was unanimously chosen as presiding officer. He rarely spoke during debates, choosing instead to guide proceedings through his demeanor and judgment. His presence encouraged delegates to remain serious and focused and to compromise when necessary. Many participants later noted that Washington's involvement lent the entire effort legitimacy. Without him, the Constitution might have faced greater skepticism or failed altogether. The Constitution that emerged from the convention created a stronger federal government with an executive, a bicameral legislature, and an independent judiciary. It reflected compromises between large and small states, slaveholding and non-slaveholding regions, and advocates of strong central power versus those favoring state autonomy. Public debate over ratification was intense, but for many Americans, the expectation that Washington would serve as the first president eased fears. They trusted that he would not abuse power and that his leadership would help the new system take root. Thus, Washington's attempted return to a purely private life proved temporary. The nation's difficulties and his own sense of duty drew him back into public service. The farmer of Mount Vernon would once again become a national leader, this time not as a general, but as the first chief executive of the United States. Chapter 10, First in War, First in Peace. The First Presidency and Building a Government. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, a reflection of the extraordinary trust he commanded. He approached the office with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. Aware that every action he took would set a precedent, he was determined to shape the presidency in a way that combined sufficient authority with Republican restraint. He rejected monarchical trappings, insisting that he be addressed simply as president rather than elaborate honorifics, and balanced dignity with accessibility. From the outset, Washington faced the practical task of turning constitutional language into working institutions. The Constitution created the framework but not the details of executive departments, judicial structures, and administrative procedures. With the support of Congress, Washington oversaw the creation of key departments, state, treasury, war, and appointed capable leaders to head them. His choices reflected both talent and political balance. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox at War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. These men formed the President's Cabinet, an institution not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but established by Washington's practice. He convened them to seek advice, debate policies, and coordinate government actions. In doing so, he set a pattern of executive decision-making that future presidents would follow and adapt. One of the most pressing challenges facing the new government was financial. The United States carried significant debt from the Revolution, owed to both domestic and foreign creditors. Hamilton proposed a comprehensive financial program, the federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and measures to establish good credit and encourage manufacturing. Washington carefully weighed Hamilton's proposals, considering objections from some who feared centralized financial power, and ultimately endorsed the core components. The implementation of Hamilton's plan helped stabilize the nation's finances, signaled that the federal government honored its obligations, and laid foundations for economic growth. However, it also contributed to emerging political divisions. Jefferson and James Madison worried that Hamilton's vision favored commercial and urban interests over agrarian ones, and that a national bank stretched constitutional authority. Washington became the arbiter in these disputes, often siding with Hamilton, but trying to maintain a posture above party lines. Domestically, Washington's administration also confronted questions of federal authority and popular resistance. The most significant early test was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, in which farmers in western Pennsylvania protested a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. Many saw the tax as unfair and reminiscent of British policies they had opposed before the Revolution. As protests escalated into intimidation and violence against tax collectors, Washington decided that the new government must assert its right to enforce laws. Invoking the Militia Act, he called up a force of state militia and, in a powerful symbolic gesture, personally reviewed the troops as they marched west, although he did not lead them into the field. The show of force, combined with efforts at negotiation, dispersed the rebellion with little bloodshed. For Washington and many contemporaries, this episode demonstrated that the federal government had both the will and the means to maintain order, while also showing restraint by not imposing excessive punishment. During his presidency, Washington also dealt with issues related to Western expansion and relations with indigenous nations. Treaties, boundary disputes, and conflict on the frontier posed ongoing challenges. Washington supported efforts to regularize relations and define borders, though policies often favored settler expansion at the expense of indigenous communities, reflecting broader patterns in American history. Throughout these domestic initiatives, Washington was mindful of his role as a model. He traveled to different regions, visiting New England and southern states to promote national unity and show that the federal government belonged to all citizens, not just those near the capital. His demeanor, formal but approachable, reserved yet attentive, helped imbue the presidency with an aura of stability and impartiality. By the mid-1790s, the basic structures of the U.S. government were in place, and Washington's leadership had provided continuity and legitimacy. Yet new challenges, particularly in foreign policy and partisan politics, tested his vision of a unified republic. Chapter 11. Neutral Paths and Partisan Storms. Foreign Policy, Parties, and Farewell. Foreign policy loomed large during Washington's presidency. The French Revolution, which began as a quest for liberty and reform, soon plunged Europe into war. Britain and France, the two great powers that had shaped American colonial history, now clashed again. Their conflict put immense pressure on the United States, whose economy and security were intertwined with transatlantic trade. Many Americans initially sympathized with revolutionary France, seeing parallels with their own struggle for independence. Others worried about the excesses and violence of the French Revolution and favored closer ties with Britain. Washington's challenge was to navigate these passions while protecting American interests and avoiding entanglement in European wars. In 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain impartial in the conflict between France and its enemies. He believed that the young nation was too fragile to risk war, and that preserving peace was essential for consolidating independence and economic development. Neutrality did not mean indifference. It meant asserting the right to trade with all sides while staying out of military alliances. The neutrality policy, however, was controversial. French envoy Edmond Charles Genet, Citizen Genet, attempted to enlist American support and privateers for the French cause, appealing directly to public opinion and bypassing the administration. Washington and his cabinet demanded his recall, asserting the government's authority over foreign relations. This affair highlighted both the volatility of public sentiment and the necessity, in Washington's view, of disciplined diplomacy. Relations with Britain remained strained due to unresolved issues from the Revolutionary War and British interference with American shipping. To avoid conflict, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty. The resulting Jay Treaty, signed in 1794, secured British withdrawal from some western forts and provided mechanisms to address debts and trade disputes. But it did not fully resolve all grievances and was seen by critics as too conciliatory. Domestically, the treaty provoked fierce debate. Supporters argued that it preserved peace and stabilized commerce. Opponents claimed it favored Britain over France and betrayed Republican principles. The controversy over Jay's treaty deepened political divisions and contributed to the crystallization of two emerging political groups: Federalists, who generally supported Washington and Hamilton's policies, and Democratic Republicans, associated with Jefferson and Madison, who opposed them. Washington found the rise of partisan politics deeply troubling. He had hoped that differences of opinion could be managed within a framework of shared commitment to the public good, and that the president could remain above faction. Instead, newspapers and pamphleteers attacked policies and personalities with growing intensity, sometimes criticizing Washington himself. Though he retained immense respect, he felt the strain of governing amid ideological conflict and personal attacks. By the end of his second term, Washington was weary. He believed that remaining too long in office could set a dangerous precedent, and that rotation in leadership was vital for a republic. Declining to run for a third term, he prepared a farewell address to the nation, published in 1796. In this document, Washington offered reflections and warnings. He urged Americans to cherish the Union, cautioning against sectional divisions between North and South or East and West. He warned that political parties, while perhaps inevitable, could become potent engines for mischief if driven by ambition and regional or foreign influence. He advised against permanent alliances and entanglements in European affairs, advocating for a foreign policy based on independent judgment and temporary agreements suited to circumstances. The farewell address was not merely a personal valedictory. It became a foundational text for American political culture. For decades, presidents and citizens cited its counsel on unity, parties, and foreign policy. While later generations debated how closely the country followed his advice, Washington's perspective shaped expectations about the proper stance of the United States in world affairs and the responsibilities of its leaders. Chapter 12. The Last Years of Cincinnatus. Final retirement, death, and legacy. Having completed 2 terms as president, Washington returned once again to Mount Vernon in 1797. This second retirement, like the first, reflected his desire to step away from public burdens and his belief in the importance of civilian life. Yet he did not withdraw entirely from public concerns. He remained in correspondence with political figures, offering advice and comments on current issues, including the growing tensions between the United States and revolutionary France. During the so-called quasi-war with France, an undeclared naval conflict in the late 1790s, President John Adams pressed Washington to accept a nominal role as commander of a provisional army in case of invasion. Washington agreed on the condition that active command in the field would fall to younger officers, reflecting his continued sense of duty and recognition of his age. The crisis subsided without full-scale war, and Washington did not return to active service, but his willingness to be called upon underscored his enduring stature. At Mount Vernon, Washington managed daily operations and continued his agricultural experiments. He also increasingly confronted the moral and practical questions posed by slavery. While he remained a slaveholder throughout his life, he grew uneasy with the institution. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he made provisions in his will to free the enslaved people he directly owned after Martha's death, and he provided for the support of those who were old or infirm. These actions did not erase the fact that he had benefited from slavery for decades, but they indicated an evolving conscience and set a precedent that some later observers found significant. In December 1799, Washington's health took a sudden turn. After riding in cold, wet weather to inspect his property, he developed a severe throat infection. Over the next 2 days, his condition worsened as doctors applied the standard treatments of the time, including repeated bloodletting and other interventions that, by modern standards, likely weakened him further. Despite periods of apparent improvement, he struggled to breathe and speak. On the evening of December 14th, 1799, George Washington died at Mount Vernon, surrounded by a few close associates and enslaved attendants. He remained composed and concerned about the details of his estate and the comfort of those around him until near the end. His last hours, like much of his public life, were marked by dignity and self-control. News of Washington's death traveled quickly and prompted an outpouring of grief and eulogy across the young nation. Memorial services and tributes were held in cities and towns, and public figures compared him to classical Republican heroes such as Cincinnatus, who returned to his plow after serving as dictator of Rome in a time of crisis. Americans mourned not only the man, but also what he symbolized: unity, virtue, and the successful establishment of a republic in a world dominated by monarchies. Over time, Washington's image became central to American civic culture. Paintings, statues, biographies, and stories, some accurate, others embroidered or invented, constructed a national icon. Tales like the cherry tree anecdote, though apocryphal, reinforced ideals of honesty and moral rectitude associated with his name. Schools, towns, and the nation's capital carried his name, embedding him in the geography as well as the memory of the United States. Historians and citizens have continued to reassess Washington, emphasizing different aspects of his life: his leadership and restraint, his role as a slaveholder, his frontier experiences, his cautious yet effective presidency. Yet across debates, certain themes remain. He was a man acutely aware of reputation, driven by duty, and capable of learning from experience. He used power, but he was also willing to relinquish it twice at critical moments. From his youth on Virginia plantations and survey lines, through his trial by fire in imperial wars and revolution, to his shaping of the presidency and final years at Mount Vernon, Washington's life traced the arc of America's transformation, from colony to nation. From an American perspective, his biography is not simply the story of one man, but a lens through which to view the emergence of a new political experiment, with all its contradictions, aspirations, and enduring challenges.